So this is the second week of studying the road, and in the book, an edition that I have from the vintage paperback copy, it's starting at page 145 and going forward. So I wanted to read, to begin with, just a few pages, a few different sections from McCarthy. So I'm doing this because I think in some ways the best way to understand McCarthy in this book is to hear his style, because it's a very unusual, spare, and almost prose poetry style. I do have in that second bullet point that prose is a form of language that has no formal metric structure. In other words, there's not a rhyme, there's not a kind of rhythm to it. If you know Shakespeare, he used the iambic pentameter, the 5 so-called feet of unstressed, stressed syllables. It's not metrical like that, but he applies, or prose poetry does, applies a natural flow of speech and ordinary grammatical structure rather than the rhythmic structure, such as the case of traditional poetry. So actually, while we're there, let me just mention this idea of free verse, which began to really take form certainly by the 20th century, but even earlier. This is free verse, or vers libre, which is the French way of talking about it. And I'm quoting from the Modern British Literature book in the Oxford Anthology of English Literature. Kermode and Hollander are the authors and editors. So, free verse. Generally, any English verse from whose lines are measured neither by the number of 1 stressed syllables or 2 alliterations of stressed and unstressed syllables or syllables alone. These authors, these editors, put the earliest English free verse, that of Christopher Smart, in the 18th century. And it's imitating the biblical tradition of the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, and thus Hebrew poetry, maintaining unmeasured units marked by syntactic parallelism. So in other words, the syntax, the structure of the sentence itself, gives you a sense of parallelism. Not so important for McCarthy, but it gives you a sense of free verse. Let me just continue. While many free verse traditions, like that of Walt Whitman, remain close to the impulses of this biblical poetry, in the 20th century, and McCarthy's book is just after the 20th century, of course, there's a sort of ad hoc patterning that is a kind of situational patterning of their own. So it's this kind of experimental use of free verse that makes it into McCarthy's prose book, which is not, in other words, non-poetry book, that still has a kind of poetic structure to it. And if you want to look up more, you can go to literarydevices.net/prose. Okay, so I sort of feel like I interrupted myself there, but on page 178, there's this beautiful passage which I put into the prompt for this week, or the initial part for the discussion board. Page 178, again in the vintage paperback edition. He'd slept little in weeks. When he woke in the morning, the boy was not there, and he sat up with a pistol in his hand and then stood and looked for him, but he was not in sight. He pulled on his shoes and walked out to the edge of the trees. Bleak dawn in the east. The alien sun commencing its cold transit. He saw the boy coming at a run across the fields. "Papa," he called, "there's a train in the woods." There's just something beautiful about that spareness of McCarthy's language, the ability to say so much in so few words. If you're given over at all to now vintage rockers U2, The Edge, who's the guitarist in U2, talked about how notes are expensive. The Edge is known for not using many notes in his guitar work for U2, and that's the way that McCarthy approaches his work. He doesn't use a lot of extra words. Okay, page 180 to page 181, again in my vintage paperback edition, has this, which describes the apocalyptic setting that they're in. They began to come upon from time to time small cairns of rock by the roadside. There were signs in gypsy language, lost patterns. The first he'd seen in some wild common in the north, leading out of the looted and exhausted cities. hopeless messages to loved ones lost and dead. By then all stores of food had given out, and murder was everywhere upon the land. The world soon to be largely populated by men who would eat your children in front of your eyes, and the cities themselves held by corps of blackened looters who tunneled among the ruins and crawled from the white rubble of tooth and eye, carrying charred and anonymous tins of food in nylon nets like shoppers in the commissaries of hell. The soft black tack blew through the streets like squid ink uncoiling along a sea floor, and the cold crept down, and the dark came early, and the scavengers passing down the steep canyons with their torches trod silky holes in the drifted ash that closed behind them silently as eyes. Out on the road, the pilgrims sank down and fell over and died, and the bleak and shrouded earth was trundled past the sun, and returned again as trackless and as unremarked as the path of any nameless sister world in the ancient dark beyond. So that's the apocalyptic scenario that McCarthy is laying out. And we don't quite know what's going on with this apocalyptic scenario, but it is significant to be sure. All right, two more sections. This comes from page 219 in my book, and it's this image of carrying fire, which comes in different ways, and which some of you have commented on. When he went back to the fire, he knelt and smoothed her hair as she slept, and he said if there were God, he would have made the world just so, and no different. Which for him is a scene, for the protagonist, the main character, a scene from the past that adds sadness and poignancy to the present. And then finally, again, the theme of hope in this bleak novel. Page 267 in the vintage edition, toward the end. They slept the day there, sitting among the boxes and crates. "You have to talk to me," he said. "I'm talking." "Are you sure?" "I'm talking now." "Do you want to tell me a story?" "No." "Why not?" The boy looked at him and looked away. "Why not?" "Those stories are not true." "They don't have to be true. They're stories." "Yes, but in the stories we're always helping people. And we don't help people." So a few passages. I mentioned those as ways to stimulate your thinking as you prepare for the paper that's coming, in which you'll see a prompt in for April 12th. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. But let me just then move to this idea of realism, which was an emerging part of American literature particularly. I'm now quoting from the Anthology of American Literature. This is Volume 2, Realism to the Present, second edition. This came out in the 20th century, so it's speaking up into the end of the last millennium, the last century. But here it is. Let me read a little bit from you. This is for you. This is from the general editor, George McMichael, from Macmillan, who is the publisher. I'm quoting. "By the end of the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, most of the forces that would typify 20th century America had begun to emerge. Northern industrialism had triumphed over Southern agrarianism, and from that victory came a society based on mass labor and mass consumption. Mechanization spread rapidly as steam engines linked to machines displaced handwork on farms and in factories. The conditions of labor changed, for the new machines, with their great cost and efficiency, seemed far more valuable and more useful than the workers who tended them. Yet increasing numbers of Americans left the farms to seek jobs in urban factories." And so this move to urbanization begins this period of realism in American literature that starts in the late 19th century, the late 1800s, and moves into the 20th century. And then the final two paragraphs from the introduction to this quite large 2,000-page anthology of American literature. Naturalism, that's this idea of making, I'm not reading anymore, but it's the idea of making the most natural and kind of non-supernatural approach to literature, non-idealistic, not magic realism or whatever, and realism, this idea of bringing the real harsh realities of human life. Naturalism, and now I'm quoting, naturalism like realism had come from Europe. In America, it had been shaped by the war, by the social upheavals that undermined the comforting faith of an earlier age, and by the disturbing teachings of Charles Darwin. Darwinism seemed to stress the animality of man, to suggest that man was dominated by the irresistible forces of evolution. The pessimistic and deterministic ideas of naturalism pervaded the works of such writers as Stephen Crane, Frank Norris, Jack London, Henry Adams, and Theodore Dreiser. Their detailed descriptions of the lives of the downtrodden and the abnormal, the frank treatment of humans' passion and sexuality, and the portrayal of men and women overwhelmed by the blind forces of nature still exert a powerful influence on modern writers. And I would add on Cormac McCarthy. Although realism and naturalism were products of the 19th century, their final triumph came in the 20th century with the popular and critical successes of early writers such as Edwin Arlington Robinson, Willa Cather, Sherwood Anderson, Robert Frost, and William Faulkner. And I would add that Faulkner has a huge effect on McCarthy's style if you know Faulkner. Continuing, but the triumph of realism, even in the 20th century, did not bring an end to the extremes of romanticism, for they still abound in the popular television heroes and heroines of unspotted virtue and dazzling accomplishments. Yet the coming of realism, with all its limitations, in all its varieties, permanently transformed American culture. Realism helped prepare the way for the continuous social and artistic revolution that has characterized America in the 20th century, and I would add that led into the 21st century. And finally, the ideas of realism still remained a fundamental and pervading part of our national life, and certainly of the work that we're reading of Cormac McCarthy. So again, let me just mention that the paper will be due by the end of the day on Sunday, April 12th. And in it, I want you to look at the apocalyptic scenarios of the road. And by the way, this will all be detailed in the prompt more clearly, but to look at some of the key quotations as one way to do that. Additionally, you could watch the film and do some comparative analysis between the film and the book. Another way is to look at the current apocalyptic scenarios we're facing with global climate change and so on. So more on that in a later prompt. All right. So then finally, let me just read something about as you create your paper. I think it's always important to work with some of the key elements. And I think a thesis statement is still very important. Perhaps some of your writing teachers have said that it's time to move beyond thesis statements. I would like to say that we still do well if we have a guiding principle. So in the video that I also gave you, there's two ways to go about it. I'm going to say that a thesis statement is probably the easiest way to succeed at a paper. To let me know what, or as a reader, to let me, or whatever reader, know what you're going to be about. So a strong thesis usually comes at the end of the first paragraph, and it should be specific. For example, quote, European travel is a good way to spend your summer, end of quote, is not specific enough. Why is European travel good? You need to further examine the topic and the heart of that topic and focus on very specific areas of European travel and support that, which you can support with evidence. So like, as an example, this is better. Quote, solo European travel requires independence, which in the end bolsters personal confidence, end of quote. It's much more specific and targeted, and you can hone in on your research, or in this case, you could hone in on the quotes and support from the book. If you say, in the road, the key element really is the love between the father and the son, and it demonstrates how love goes to extremes. I don't know, that's just, came up with that off the cuff. You can see if you think that's good or bad. So here's another thesis example, statement example. A bad one would be, high levels of alcohol consumption are bad for you. The problem is so broad. You need to understand what are the specific detriments that alcohol consumption that you want to discuss and address in the paper and, in a way, argue for. So a better one is high levels of alcohol consumption have detrimental effects on your personal health, such as weight gain, heart disease, and liver complications. You see here how you get specific in your reasons. You don't have to state every single detriment you're going to lay out. In fact, that would produce a kind of long run-on sentence, but you can point to the main areas you'll explore. So here again is the key to a good thesis statement that guides your paper and lets me know as your reader and as your grader what you're going to be about. When developing your one-sentence thesis statement, it is important for you to be specific, specific, specific. Write your thesis statement once and then write it again with greater specificity. This goes back to the idea of writing and rewriting, and the idea that you should be writing at least 3 drafts of your paper. Here you want to write drafts of your thesis statement. In addition, be sure your audience will want to learn these new facts. So if you're looking at the novel, is the reader interested in what you're going to say about the road? And possibly your reader's going to want to frame a new opinion, or at least redefine or reaffirm an opinion already held. And that gives you a place to know where your scope of your paper is and what you're going to address. All right, I hope that's been helpful. Some examples from the road, some ideas on Cormac McCarthy's style, some placement of his work within the realism of American literature, and then an idea of how to write the paper that'll be due on April 12th. There you have it.